Hello, lovely to be here today in the Wheeler Centre on the Soapbox. If I have to pause and drink 40 litres of water, it's because I've taken cold and flu tablets and my head is a little bit like, the tide is low right now, that's all I'm saying. A few months ago, I was featured in The Age as part of Michael Short's series, The Zone, where people from various backgrounds talk about an idea. For my moment in the publicity sun, I decided to talk about the popularisation of poetry. My pitch was to put poetry on primetime TV. Screw the X Factor, I want to see something that's actually good. I'm sick of hearing about the contents of Matt Preston's stomach or watching actual paint dry on the walls for the renovators. I asked people to imagine having their souls unravelled like a ribbon at 7:30 p.m. on a Thursday night. I asked people to imagine a world where young people performed original thoughts and words instead of singing other people's pop lyrics to douche muffins like Kyle Sandilands. In my opinion, poetry has the power for prime time. I'm talking specifically about performance poetry, slam poetry. Slam, if you're not sure, is a short form, usually only a few minutes long. It's a good-natured poetry battle where poets perform their work individually or in teams. Generally, judges are picked at random from the audience and they hold up a score out of 10 for each performer. It works on the idea that poetry is for the people, that you don't need a degree or a doctorate to judge poetry. It's about what you like, what you feel, what inspires you to whoop and cheer. It got started in the US in the early 80s by a guy called Mark Smith, who wanted to add a little bit of sizzle to a normal poetry slam. Reading. It's taken off and it happens all around the world in tournaments, drawing audiences to everything from small bars to stadiums. Slam poetry is direct and immediate. It gets across to its audience straight away. However, as Mark Smith famously said, the point is not the point is poetry. And it's this philosophy that makes for a strong, growing community. Slam uses living language to spark debate, propose amazing ideas, offer insight into generational thinking, or explore deeply personal matters of identity, self-worth, and ambition. It delves into controversial topics, hilarious, deep, and brilliant observations around the world. And I believe it would make fucking great TV. The article went down well and got a few people talking about it being an actual possibility. A couple of weeks later, Christopher Bantick, a Melbourne writer and senior English editor at Trinity Grammar in Kew, responded with a piece in The Australian. He was appalled at my suggestion. He finds the thought of poetry on TV aiming for a popular audience nothing short of horrifying. And sadly, Christopher represents a not uncommon view among some of the poetry world, that poetry is sacred and must be appreciated quietly in high towers on the page with time to pick apart its meaning and absorb it and sup from its worthy benevolence. I hate this elitist idea of poetry and the way it dismisses slam and performance poetry as somehow a lesser art, and I think it's worth refuting some of its very daft claims. Bantick starts off his article by offering me his deepest respect. In case you didn't know, Australian performance poet Emilie Zoey Baker is the International Poetry Slam champion. Well, actually, I'm not. He was referring to how The Age described me. It was an unfortunate overstatement of my success in a slam in Berlin, but hey, you know what? We get the point. As if anyone's even heard of me. An international champion of nonsense. He continues. To assume that slam is poetry is enough to make the muse mute. Yes, he refers to the muse, without irony, making him sound like Monty in Withnell and I. Still, it's not Baker's slam success we should be worried about. Thanks, Chris. It's a suggestion that poetry should be on primetime television and replace programs such as MasterChef. What Baker and her fellow versifiers have failed to understand is that celebrity poets do more harm than good. Celebrity poets, like I mean, you know, he's probably thinking about celebrity poets, like, yeah. Well, you know, hey, look, if he means the only poet that most of us have heard of, Les Murray, then, well, perhaps he has a point. Murray's contribution to John Howard's constitutional preamble, "We're a nation of mates," didn't really do much good. Or maybe he means celebrity poets like Henry Lawson or Banjo Patterson. Very popular in the day, published widely and regularly, read by all and learnt to heart by many. Harmful? No? Well, Christopher, could you give us an example? Any example of a harmful celebrity poet? How about any celebrity poet at all? Nope. Well, touche. He then continues, "Poetry will not regain its place in the national conscience by our reducing it to a public mosh pit. According to Baker, Australia rejects poetry." Actually, I didn't say that. "And hence her evangelism for pop poetry extravaganzas. But the problem with poetry is not that it is overlooked, rather it depends on what kind of poetry we're talking about. Those who know what great poetry is covet its place in the culture. Pop poems may pull punters to the pubs, but that is all." So here we get to the nub of Christopher's dismay. What I've proposed involves popular poetry, not great culture. People might like it, but it would have no value. What a dismal prospect a tour through Christopher's record collection would be. From classical to classical, all the way through to classics to some classical. Great works, each pitched directly to the soul. But I imagine that's probably not true. He's probably got some James Taylor, some Miles Davis, maybe some kind of blue, a cherished Dylan record or two from his youth, Paul Kelly's hits compilation maybe. He's likely comfortable with the idea of ranging interests in music with different materials suited to different purposes, but each creative, valuable and rewarding. Why should poetry be any different? Why is the thought of a popular form of poetry so frightening? Why can't poetry be loud and brash, delivered with passion and energy, readily understood, thought-provoking and entertaining all at once? There's no threat in trying to popularise poetry, to give it new shapes and new audience. I'm not suggesting that slam poetry should somehow replace all other forms, any more than Christopher's teen flirtation with the Beatles means that he has to throw out his Brahms. No one is saying drop that Judith Wright poem and listen to these Kanye West lyrics. Nobody is saying burn volumes of T.S. Eliot and beat old people for reading Wordsworth. Why can't slam be added to the ways our culture expresses itself? Why can't we enjoy Judith Wright as well as, I don't know, Brisbane performer Ghost Boy or Maya Angelou alongside Melbourne's own Sean M. Whelan? The likes of Bantick argue that pop poetry can't be taken seriously because it isn't any good. Poets such as Baker, Christopher says, who want to give us wham and slam, yes, I do think he would say wham with a wha, need to face this reality. Their poetry depends on personality and pyrotechnics, but as poetry, it does not scan. Good poetry takes time to understand. It takes emotional and intellectual investment. The buy-in is something more enduring than a bright flare of words. So slam most certainly cannot join the ranks of great art. Well, not as all slam poetry is great. Sure, you know, I've seen some shocking crap. But I've also seen bad music, bad art, bad theatre, bad opera, and bad journalism. It's clear to me that Christopher hasn't ever been to a slam. He hasn't seen a crowd leap to its feet as a coruscating critique of our modern lives ends with a redemptive cry to pull together, to do better, as in Omar Musa's My Generation, which was recently featured on Q&A, which is on TV. It stirs something in audiences of all ages. And he's probably never seen Taylor Marley, whose poem, What Teachers Make, has attracted 3,166,370 views on YouTube, disturbingly like bringing poetry to the masses. A page on Taylor's website called 1000 Teachers is a list of people that have been so moved by his poetry that they were inspired to become a teacher. But no, apparently pop poems only pull people to the pubs, and that's all. Just another celebrity poet doing more harm than good. And despite being a senior teacher of English, it seems Christopher hasn't witnessed young school kids thrilled to discover a voice and an ability to get up in front of a crowd and perform their own work. A huge boon to their self-confidence as much as their creative talents. He fails to see that it's an electric way to get young people in particular interested in poetry, in a way they struggle to with traditional forms. As part of my work at Australian Poetry, I teach creative writing and performance poetry in schools. At different age levels, I also created the Super Poets, a team of professional performance poets who visit schools to teach kids slam. When we go into a school, we're often greeted with a sigh and an eye roll. Why? Because a lot of kids see poetry as boring, stale, girly, stupid, irrelevant and lame, unquote. I had a girl once say to me, when I first heard we were doing poetry, I was gutted. But by the end of the weeks that we spent with her class, showing her what poetry could be, asking her what she wanted to say, showing her examples of performances that made it feel like the top of her head was floating off, that same student turned around to me and said, I want to make a career out of poetry now. Why the change of heart? Because we didn't just make them read out Henry Lawson until they could recite a few verses by rote. We let them hear the amazing Saul Williams, alongside Jill Jones, alongside Keats, alongside, yes, Eminem. We asked them questions about their lives, their passions, showed them clips of kids performing so well that other kids leapt out of their chairs to scream and cheer. Showed them a YouTube video of acclaimed American slam poet Andrea Gibson's poem, Birthday, at 9:30 a.m. on a Monday morning, and had teenagers fighting back tears for things they didn't even know they felt yet. As part of the AP education program, I also coordinate Out Loud, a teen poetry slam where teenagers get up and perform their own words to a crowd of peers and professional judges, culminating in a slam final at Federation Square during the Melbourne Writers' Festival. The students love it, and teachers are constantly amazed at what their kids can do. I received this feedback from Anthony Young, Head of English at Bramer College in Woodend. Out Loud was so instrumental in getting my students hooked on poetry, writing, performance and language in general. The Super Poets visit to our school beforehand was a great way to invigorate and enthuse the students and show them a different style of poetry that immediately tapped into their popular cultural interests and reversed some of their perceptions of what poetry was. The opportunity to perform in front of such a supportive and enthusiastic audience and feel that their creativity and enthusiasm for the arts was valued was so important in their development as well-rounded people. Sounds awful, doesn't it? Well, the guardians of traditional forms of poetry don't like it. They demand something more enduring than a bright flare of words. What these snobbish critics are missing is that the next generation of wordsmiths, performers and readers are being inspired by slam, poets who offer an immediately engaging, energetic style that speaks directly to them. And they're becoming interested in poetry more generally, curious as to its roots and traditions. I know that's how I came to appreciate poetry, through exposure to performance poetry. I had to laugh when, to underscore just how frivolous all this slam nonsense was, Christopher sought to contrast my winning a slam title with Chris Wallace-Crabbe receiving the Order of Australia for services to the arts as a leading poet, critic and educator. Well, yes, it's wonderful news. And it's wonderful news that an esteemed poet received such wonderful recognition, and no one here at Slam TV wants to take that away from him. But unlike the columnist for The Australian, Chris Wallace-Crabbe is a supporter of innovative poetry in schools and a supporter of slam. How do I know this? Because he's on the board of my employer, Australian Poetry, and is a supporter of our teen poetry slam Out Loud. Not at all snobby. Chris Wallace-Crabbe loves to see Australian students excited about poetry through performance. He might even make a great judge on the Slam Poetry TV show. really. I mean, how dare Bantick disregard contemporary poets, slam poets, and more horrifyingly, how dare he, a teacher of English in our schools, deliberately wish to deny our kids access to everything that poetry can be and that is. It's like the white American radio stations banning the devil's music in the 50s, or railing against photography being hung in a gallery, or bringing a court case against Allen Ginsberg's Howl. It's ridiculous. It's anti-imagination, anti-creativity, and the denial of the emergence of new art forms, styles and genres that will take their place alongside the traditional. And it's futile. As shown by the great modern parable of the 80s, Footloose. You can only ban fun for so long. Kevin Bacon will eventually dance his woolly little socks off. Poetry in all its forms is essentially a love letter to language. And a poet is somebody who gets off on words. They can't help it. I'll spend whole days trying to think of a single simile to fit into a poem because I respect, admire and adore words. Every single one of those little buggers. Page, stage or slam, that's what poets do. There's further irony in the elitist kit bag. Bantick bemoans the loss of the place of poetry in national memory. Poems, he says, can be a comfort and inspiration, not to mention sustaining when we hunger for meaning and solace. Gens X and Y are impoverished and have no storehouse of verse to call on. The art of committing great poems to memory is lost. Whether one likes Banjo Patterson's The Man from Snowy River is immaterial. Many of us can recite the first verse, at least. And that's better, isn't it? Poetry you don't like that you're forced to learn by rote, like the multiplication tables, with a rap on the knuckles for a faltering memory. Wholesome, cultural, good for the soul. You daft man. If you want to hear somebody leap to their feet and let rip glorious lines of rich, memorised, meaningful language, a slam is exactly where you want to be. And actually, while we're here, traditional bush poetry and slam and hip-hop styles are actually not that far apart, really. They're written to be memorised and recited using pronounced rhythm, metre and rhyme. But more importantly, while great poems of the ages speak to the human condition, surely we want to hear and engage with poetry that speaks to us of our lives right now. Saul Williams, Shane Koizan, along with Dorothy Porter, Henry Rollins, and Indigenous hip-hop artist Brother Black. That's not to reject great works of the past. It's to contribute to our culture that we live in now and perhaps guide us into the future. Christopher goes on, waxing lyrical about the virtues of great poetry, including the lasting impact of the likes of T.S. Eliot and so on. Great poems live and last, he sighs, like Rumpole of the Bailey delivering his final statement to the jury. Give us a chance, Chris. We might just deliver something future generations will revere. The high culture vaunted by the likes of Bantick is admirable in the main, but why do these elitist Don Quixotes insist on tilting at windmills? None of the poetry they worship is harmed by the idea of presenting a different popular style to the masses. No one is saying traditional forms should be rendered irrelevant, that they must be erased. Slam isn't tearing down the temple, it's just building a dance floor next door. It's offering a different gateway to the love of language or expression and communication. Why is that such a dire prospect? Why is the fact that it sometimes makes people jump to their feet and cheer so vulgar? Isn't it in fact something to be celebrated? I think it is. So let's go back to where this all started. Why would anyone be so appalled by the idea of putting it on television? Of trying to reach people that would normally have no intention of attending a poetry event, let alone a slam event, but might flick on the latest reality TV show to see what it's all about. Australian television audiences evidently relish competitions and reality settings. So why not see how they react to the breadth of talent this country has in spoken word performance and slam poetry? I think lots of people would react just as they do at a great live slam event. It's like being at a rock concert or a headline comedy gig. Wham and slam? Hell yeah! I think a live setting would be best, actually, like Rock Quiz or Australian Idol. And it's not only for the young. The 2009 National Australian Poetry Slam was won by Sarah Taylor, a 60-year-old retired librarian from Newcastle. I'm confident people would find they love the chance to cheer on a bush poet, or get behind a hip-hop word spinner, to get inspired by a politically engaged urban scene star, or go on a roller coaster ride with the brilliant and quirky mind of a normally quiet girl from the suburbs. In the US, a slam TV show, Def Poetry Jam, ran for 5 years on HBO, and the last few years they've aired Brave New Voices, a teen slam competition. I would love something like that to happen here. I want to be moved, challenged, touched, shaped and changed by original and talented performers on TV. And if such a show gets on air, and Christopher Bantick's students at Trinity College suddenly seem to show a greater interest when he drones on about Keats, no need to thank us. Thank the muse. Thank you.